Yeah, it's been really wet around here. And a lot of the underbrush is growing in pretty thick, the raspberry bushes and stuff like that. So I probably won't spend a whole lot more time out here, wait for fall time to break down these tops and stuff like that. You know, plus for the ticks. But I got a little bit to do. And I needed to get out of the house because it's been raining like non-freaking stop. So you get a video. So I have quite a spectrum of stuff here I brought out. And I want to start with that cylinder right there. You know, check that out. Anyone know what that is? That's an old Homelite. And then the homies went to something like this. That would be for a 925 right there. And while Homelite was peddling things like this, Jonsered had developed cylinders that look something like this right here. In Husqvarna, right here. Timelines, 60s into the 70s, you know, 1970s. And that one right there is from a 285 CD. Check out that layout. And if you're a steel type, you see that layout? That would be from an MS 660. Now, when do you think that cylinder was built? And I think that's where we want to start the story. And it was built for actually that saw, which was a Husqvarna 285 CD. And the 285 CD was really kind of an outgrowth of a larger saw. And but they started selling that saw in 1977. And now things get complex because that basic chassis, that set of cases, everyone can define chassis as they see fit. To me, it's the cases that matter. If you have the same basic bottom end, crankshaft, cases, tank handle, and you change the bore to get different models, to me that's the definition of chassis. And then things like the mufflers and the anti-vibe and all that stuff which is hung around those cases are accessories. So let's just talk about that 285 for just a little bit, because the first saw that I can find that was made on that chassis was not the 85cc saw, it was the 100cc saw. And in 1973, Husqvarna released the 1100 CD. And then in 1975, they called it the 2100. In 1976, they released a smaller bore cylinder on that same basic chassis, and they called that the 185 CD. In 1977, it was called the 285 CD. And then in, I don't know, I guess around 1982 or so, they introduced the 181, which pretty much obsoleted the 85cc version of that saw. And I have no idea if Husky continued to make the 285 for much longer. But they did continue to manufacture that chassis. It was from 1975 to 85, 10 years, they had the 2100. In 86, they released a 298, which was essentially the same saw as the 2100. And so that was 1986, I guess. 87, they called it the 2101 again, and they kept making that thing until 1990. So that basic chassis lasted a long time. It was introduced in my mind in 1973, and they quit making it for the main markets in 90. And yet again, I don't know if they had passed it off to other places to be manufactured elsewhere. I don't know the answer to that. But now I like the 85cc version, of which it didn't last as long as a 100cc version, simply because it got obsoleted by a more modern design. You know, the 181, the 281, and the 288 and all that stuff. So why would you compete in the same marketplace with a saw that's quite a bit more advanced technology-wise? Humble opinion. Probably didn't. So while Husqvarna was selling these and evolving this chassis, Jonsered was peddling stuff like this. And interesting to me is, I don't know if the tail was wagging the dog in this scenario, because these were introduced. This is a 801. I think it has an 80 cover. I'm not really sure specifically what the difference is between an 80 and an 801 are, but that basic chassis was released in 1970, and they keep selling those things in some form until 1980. And again, it was a chassis that kind of reminds me of the L77, where the gas and bar oil, it's one big set of cases that houses everything. And I don't know, I had opined once before, Jonsered had a boot pretty early on, so that might be one of the reasons they were able to continue that and not have issues with things like vapor lock and stuff like that. So anyway, the 80 and 801 appear to have been marketed from 1970 to 1980. And unlike Husky, who introduced the chassis for this saw in 73, it might have been a response to Jonsered, and then put a smaller cylinder on it, 85cc cylinder. Jonsered took that chassis in somewhere around 1975, put an 87cc top end on it, a little bit larger displacement top end on it, on that same chassis. And they called it a 90. I'm not sure how long they marketed the 90, but I suspect it ended around the same time they got rid of the 80. So my speculation is that entire series probably came to an end somewhere around 1980. And the next generation of Jonsered was the 910. And they had the 910, 920, 930. And that was their like 1980s generation. I would say pro saw, big felling saw. So the 910 was introduced in 1979. And I covered this in the last video, I think, a little bit. And then in 1982, they replaced the 910 with a 920, which was a fairly significant change. And then in 1986, they replaced the 920 with a 930. So here's a set of 920 cases. And one of the things of interest on this is they had the little eyebrows in the cases right here on the 920, kind of like the 910 had. And then on the 910, this is not a 910 cylinder, but it was a style like this where the lower transfer is pretty much matched up with the cases, right, on the 910. And when they came out with the 920, this is a Walter modified 920 cylinder. I've taken out the lower transfers, but basically that was looking like one of these, where you have this Husqvarna style. And they were a little doggy. I'm not sure if it's because of the mismatch between the cases and the lower transfers or not. But one of the things they did to improve the 920 with the 930, like this one right here, is this modification. They just did it at the factory somewhere in the production line, in the production time of the 930. And of course, a lot of the smart guys went back and did that to the 920s, and guess what? It woke them right up. And I did this one years and years and years ago. This is Walter work. And this was what I was talking about, how Jonsered had a boot pretty early on. Which probably allowed them to keep this style of chassis for a little longer. But now when Husky came out with those, that class, that's a 61 in the late 70s, that really, I think, was the game changer for the industry. That saw, that chassis, along with the steel 038s, I think were pretty much the genesis of the modern saw. So, and just for a little fun, how about a 461? You know, it's funny, I get a kick out of the bigger is better always with the transfer ports. And you look at a 461, which is a really good running saw. Same with the new Huskies too, with their transfers going up underneath the exhaust. It's another steel cylinder. Well, I can tell you right now, there's one difference immediately. The Husky, like I said, feels heavier. And if you look at it, you can see that it's physically larger than the Jonsered. But even though it's larger, the Jonsered holds quite a bit more fuel. And also, if you notice, the having that bar oil in the handle takes it away from the crankcase, where this was also a fairly large tank. And I wonder if that helps modulate the temperature, you know, of the bottom end of these chainsaws. And maybe that's why eventually Husky went back with the next generation of saws, where they put the oil back in the crankcase. Now, I remember telling myself the last time I ran that Jonsered 80, I was never going to run another one because it was so hard for me to get started. And that one's been sitting for a while. So let's see if it behaves a little bit better. Of course, you can't blame that on the saw design. You know, it's just because it's been sitting. I imagine if I put the same amount of time and effort into the 80 that I have on that 285, you know, it might perform a little bit better. But so let me see if I can get them started, and if I can, I'll do a little bit of saw work with them. Now, its switch is no longer there. I figured out that it was having a problem last time I ran it with the kill switch, and I haven't replaced that yet. So the only way I can stop it is by choking it, and sometimes that makes it harder to restart. has a real hot spark, so it's fuel delivery. I put a little bit of gas down the spark plug hole. And so I guess what we should do now is see if it pops. So, yeah. Let me think about that for a second. Takeaways. One of the first takeaways I got from that little operation is there's a lot more wood in this log than I realized. So I'm not going to go toss this log away. I was going to throw it away. That's solid and very bright looking on the inside. So I'm not going to work my way up the log. If anything, I'm going to go drag it up to the landing, and me and the log buyer can sort of see what's in here. But this log looks a lot better than I thought it was. So that's my first takeaway. The second takeaway, it's an ordeal to get that Jonsered started. But a lot of that is just simply getting the recoil start right, and you know, the fuel lines, stuff like that. I haven't put the time into it, and it really needs that. I'm not going to put it on video, but it was kicking back a little bit, pulled me right to the ground. Kind of embarrassing, so it's not going to find the video. But once it's running, you know, and it cleaned out a little bit, tuned a little bit, its RPMs came right up. And power-wise, I would give the Husky a little edge on that. Weight-wise, obviously the Jonsered's lighter. Life with a saw, the Husky's got it all over the Jonsered just simply because of the way it starts and restarts and stuff like that. So, boy, I'll tell you what, both those saws were very capable. There's no doubt that they were capable. But if I had to pick one to run right now, I'd pick the Husky. The other thing I like about the Husky is I like the air filter arrangement better than on the Jonsered. It has that type of a tubular type filter, goes in the back. The Husky is just something I'm more familiar with. I can make it seal up. I'm not sure I can make the Jonsered seal up. I do find it interesting that Jonsered has the bar oil, you know, in the case. That's got to help keep the case temperature sort of modulated a little bit, a little more stable. Although I haven't had any issue with that Husky, but of course I haven't run it in the hot temperatures either. It's always been fall, you know, late spring. I haven't run it during the summer much. And I like the outlet on the Jonsered better, on the muffler. I don't like the front exit mufflers on any saw, including that Husky. Husqvarna actually had a muffler that had the outlet coming to the clutch side out like the Jonsered does. If I can find one of those mufflers in decent shape, I'm going to buy it, because that'll make that saw better for me too. But I'm going to research Jonsered. I don't know whether or not the 110, 111 was a derivative of that chassis. I just don't know. Where the Husky started out with 100cc and they backed it down to an 85. I don't know if Jonsered started with a smaller chassis and just kept upping the displacement. I don't know. I'll have to go back and research that. Maybe I'll put a note at the end of the video with bore and stroke of the 110 versus this, and that would be the answer, because if it has a different stroke, it's a different case, you know, different crank. But I think the other takeaway for me is all the way back in 1970, 1980, this time frame where these things were sold. You know, these are mid-1970s offerings. They already knew how to make horsepower. Both of them make good power. open up this log. I think I'm going to drag it up to the landing instead of breaking it down more. So it's 2. You know, throw them up the landing and see if they'll sell. It's either that or they're firewood. It doesn't matter if I block them up there or block them down here, I guess. So anyway, that runs good, right? So that's the starting point for that saw, really. A couple years back, I got it going and was pretty pleased with it. I had it out with the L77 and put it away, and then I pulled it back out a while back when Bob and I were playing with these saws, and told myself I was never going to try to run that thing again. And then the Homelite kind of changed things. That 285, I've got a lot of time into it. I've been kind of tweaking on that thing now for quite some time, you know. And I think just focusing on the saw and figuring out the tune and the bar length and all that kind of stuff over time, you develop a build and a setup, and the setup is key. And I'm in the middle of it with this saw. This saw here is that 930, which is a good running saw. Those two are pretty much on par. But I need a top cover, I think. I don't want to change it back to a 920 because it is a true 930, you know what I'm saying? And this saw here, I don't know. I think because of the mythology around these things deserves, see if I can't develop into something where it'll ride around the back of this, you know, cart. But the Homelite is officially retired. The 285 has officially replaced it. Not so much because it's all that much better, other than the fact that I don't want to wear out the 540. Just simply aren't parts for them. But I can get parts for this, and I was able to whip this into a setup that I actually can use. So that's why, you know, there's more parts available. There's aftermarket support for these things. And then we'll see. This one might rise to the top, but yet again, like the Homelite 540, I will tend not to turn this into, you know, a commonly used work saw, just simply because the parts aren't there. Which is the other thing about this 285. I can, you know, bearings and seals and top ends and all that stuff are available. So I can turn that into an actual work saw. So life with a saw, you know. So out of all these vintage saws, the Husky did rise to the top. Not because of specs, not because of weight, just because it's easier to live with and start and run, and it's easier to get parts for support, and the sacrifice is the weight.